Our speaker's impact on politics, as I have said, has been profound, and his advice has been sought by political leaders and chief executives from Asia, Latin America, and Australia, as well as the USA and Europe. It is my great pleasure to introduce Professor Lord Giddens. Thank you.
I do wish everyone here a really productive, interesting, and happy day in Windsor Castle. My proposition to you is that climate change is the most dangerous risk which, as collective humanity, we face in the 21st century. It's important to recognize that climate change has no precedent in previous history. It is something completely new. No other civilization before ours has remotely, even remotely, being able to intervene in nature to the degree to which our civilization has done and is doing every day. It's really important to recognize that climate change, although it intersects with a variety of other global problems, is quite different in nature from those problems. Global poverty is a bad thing, right? Global poverty will be a bad thing if it's the same in 2050 as it is now. Climate change is quite different. If we don't arrest the discharge of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, accelerating still all the time, each year, those gases accumulate in the atmosphere. We don't know how to get rid of them. Some of those greenhouse gases will be there from anything to a century to 1,000 years. Climate change has a here and now quality which other global problems do not have. And we are, I think, at a crux of history, really, in trying to cope with it. I feel I should say just a little bit and preface before talking about China's climate change policies about the risks that climate change poses for us, because there's been so much stuff in the press about this recently. If you forgive me being a bit didactic about it, there are three basic positions which people take about climate change. In other words, the acceleration of average global temperatures over the past 150 years, that's what climate change is. Three basic positions that you find. Very important to have an understanding of these, and I'd like to try and give you a reference point for them, because from one's assessment of these, that's where policy implications come. First of all, there are the views of the climate change skeptics. The climate change skeptics either deny that world temperatures are increasing, or else they say they're not caused by human intervention, not caused by the production of greenhouse gases through the burning of fossil fuels, they're natural phenomena, or they say the risks are exaggerated, not really as risky as many people think. Climate change skeptics make up something like 5%, I would say, no more, of the world's climate scientists. Most of the climate change skeptics are not themselves scientists. Like, for example, I don't know if you've come across Nigel Lawson, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer in this country, Finance Minister in this country. He wrote a prominent climate change skeptic book about 2 years ago. As I was saying when we were talking before, anyway, to Sean wherever he is, over there, I had a public debate with Nigel Lawson about 2 weeks ago on climate change, trying to see if we could get anywhere towards reconciling our positions. Didn't get very far. Anyhow, the skeptics make up a small proportion of those working in the area of climate change, but they have enormous public impact. That's why it's very important to mention them. They've had a lot of impact on public opinion, and in many countries, since the failure of Copenhagen meetings last year, you find that the public have become themselves more skeptical about climate change and its risks. This position, in my view, is bluntly and simply mistaken, and I've spent several years now trying to, as far as a layperson can, master the scientific literature on the risks we face, and the two alternative positions, to me, are very much closer to the truth. The second position you could call the mainstream position on climate change and the risks it poses. It's represented by the Intergovernmental Panel of the United Nations, the IPCC, produced 4 gigantic volumes on climate change and its dangers. Among the most important dangers of climate change that the reports point to is increasingly violent weather. If you have, for example, in the Caribbean area, hurricanes, considerable intensity at the moment, you have to think what it would be like if those hurricanes were 3 or 4 times as intense as we've ever known before. A really dramatic and disturbing scenario, and there are many such things in the IPCC reports. The IPCC, however, sees climate change as gradual, tends to see climate change as gradual, tend to see the risks as fairly distant, as some way down the line, and tend to have the idea, well, we've got a fair amount of time in trying to deal with these things. The third group, the radicals, very important to me anyway, the radicals argue that climate change is not only more dangerous than the mainstream says, they argue the risks of climate change are more proximate and they're more sudden than the IPCC view. The radicals argue that climate change goes through so-called tipping points in which you can get very radical changes in the world's climate within a very short period of time. This is very, very significant. If you look back in past history, and we know from millions of years there has been naturally occurring climate change at many times before, naturally occurring climate change. Sometimes you've had dramatic increase or decrease in world temperatures within as short a period as 10 years, shorter period as that. The radicals say that all over the world there are a number of tipping points which could propel us into irreversible climate change much more quickly and much more dramatically than the mainstream say. Just to give you one example, in eastern Siberia there is permafrost which has been frozen, so far as we know, for hundreds of millions of years. It is now melting. Underneath the permafrost there is an awful lot of methane gas. Methane gas is a greenhouse gas about 18 or 19 times more intense than CO2 is in terms of its effects upon the greenhouse phenomenon which underlies global warming. So the radicals say we should actually be keeping global temperatures increase well below that of the mainstream. The mainstream says, if this means anything to you, 450 parts per million we can be reasonably secure with. The radicals say we should keep to 350 parts per million. We're already above that in world concentration of CO2. Among the radicals, the names you might like to look at if you haven't done, James Hansen from NASA in the US, or James Lovelock, the celebrated British scientist. The radicals argue there's already so much climate change in the system that we'll have to deal with its consequences regardless of what happens in terms of further limitation. I have to say, having spent so much time looking at the literature, I tend to be persuaded of this case. I think the risks associated with climate change are more dangerous than the orthodox scientific community says, and the risks are therefore correspondingly greater and more urgent for us to confront. Before I come to China, let me just say that interestingly, these 3 views of climate change and its risks have an interestingly different notion of our relationship to the Earth. For the first group, the skeptics, the Earth is essentially robust and nothing we will do as little human beings, you know, is going to have any significant impact on it. For the mainstream scientific community, the Earth is fragile. We are busy destroying the ecosystems on which our own existence as human beings and that of many other species in the world depends. For the third group, interestingly, their image of the world is a different one, a much more disturbing one. They say the Earth is like a wild beast, and we're busy prodding this wild beast with sticks, and it's going to react violently to us. Quite a disturbing metaphor, I think you'll agree.